Some humiliations don't happen in private. Some are staged under crystal chandeliers, with champagne glasses raised high enough for everyone to watch you break. I still remember the sound of the laughter stopping. 1 second, the ballroom at Maple Ridge Country Club was glowing with candlelight and soft jazz, filled with my family, my church friends, and neighbors I'd known for over 30 years. The next, it felt so quiet I could hear the ice melting in my untouched glass of Chardonnay. My 68th birthday party had been Daniel's idea. My son insisted I deserved something special after everything I'd done for the family. Those were his exact words. I believed him. Maybe that was my first mistake. The private room overlooked the golf course, all green hills and white lights stretching into the warm Connecticut evening. There were nearly 40 people there. My cousins from New Jersey, my bridge club friends, Daniel's co-workers. Even Melissa's sister flew in from Chicago. Everyone kept telling me how beautiful the decorations looked. White roses, gold candles, linen tablecloths. The kind of evening that makes a woman think her family still sees her as important. Melissa had arrived 20 minutes late wearing a cream-colored dress that looked far too bridal for someone else's birthday dinner. But I ignored it. I always ignored things when it came to Melissa. That had become a survival skill over the years. "Happy birthday, Evelyn," she'd said sweetly, kissing the air beside my cheek. "You look wonderful tonight." Everyone thought she was charming. That was the thing about Melissa. She knew exactly who to be when people were watching. During dinner, she laughed loudly at Daniel's jokes and kept touching his arm like they were newlyweds instead of a couple, constantly going through a rough patch. I noticed the way Daniel avoided eye contact with me whenever she spoke. I noticed a lot of things that night. Mothers usually do. After dessert arrived, Daniel tapped his fork against his glass. "Before Mom opens her gifts," he said with a nervous smile, Melissa wanted to say a few words. First, I thought it was kind. Thought maybe she was finally trying. Melissa stood slowly, holding her champagne flute with both hands. Her eyes already looked watery. Performance was coming. I just didn't know yet that I was the target. "I know tonight is supposed to be a celebration," she began softly, her voice trembling just enough to command attention. "But sometimes the truth needs to come out." The room shifted immediately. Forks lowered. Conversations stopped. I remember Daniel staring down at the tablecloth like a little boy waiting for a storm to pass. Then Melissa looked directly at me. Not through me. At me. "Mothers-in-law like you ruin people's lives," she cried. Someone gasped near the back of the room. I felt my chest tighten, so suddenly I thought for a moment I might actually faint. Melissa wiped tears beneath perfectly applied mascara and kept going. "For years, Evelyn has manipulated Daniel, controlled our marriage, and made me feel like I'll never be good enough for this family." Every face turned toward me. 40 pairs of eyes waiting to see what kind of monster I really was. And the worst part? My own son said nothing. I do not remember standing up from the table. I only remember the heat rushing into my face and the strange pressure in my ears, like the entire room had suddenly sunk underwater. Melissa kept crying softly into a folded napkin while people stared at me with the kind of cautious silence usually reserved for funerals. "I have tried so hard to respect you," she said, shaking her head as if she were heartbroken instead of furious. "But no matter what I do, you always find a way to remind me that I am not good enough for your son." My fingers tightened around the stem of my wine glass. I looked at Daniel again, waiting for him to finally interrupt her. Waiting for him to laugh awkwardly and say this had all been some terrible misunderstanding. Instead, he rubbed his forehead and whispered, "Melissa, maybe this is not the right time." Not a denial. Not a defense. Just embarrassment. That hurt more than her speech ever could. Across the table, my cousin Joanne avoided looking at me altogether. My neighbor Linda suddenly became very interested in rearranging silverware beside her plate. It amazed me how quickly people distance themselves from discomfort when they sense public opinion shifting. Melissa took a deep breath, gathering sympathy from the room with every trembling pause. "You call Daniel 3 times a day," she continued. "You criticize our parenting. You make comments about my cooking, my clothes, even the way I decorate my own home." A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to explain that calling my son did not make me controlling. That asking if my grandson still had asthma medication at my house was not manipulation. That suggesting curtains for their living room after I helped pay for half the furniture hardly made me a villain. But the moment belonged to Melissa now. She had rehearsed this. I could feel it. Every sentence landed perfectly, polished for maximum damage. I have spent 7 years trying to earn your approval, she said, her voice cracking. And I am tired. Then came the final blow. She turned toward the guests and quietly added, "Nobody knows what it is like living under constant judgment." A woman near the back murmured, "Oh my goodness." Another guest actually nodded at her. Nodded, as if they suddenly understood a hidden truth about me that I had spent decades concealing. Daniel finally stood up, but only to place a hand on Melissa's shoulder. "Honey," he said softly, "please sit down." "Honey, not Mom. Not enough." Melissa sat, dabbing tears from her eyes while several people reached over to comfort her. Comfort her. On my birthday. In that moment, I realized something cold and terrible. This had not started tonight. People do not react that quickly unless seeds have already been planted. Stories had been told long before this dinner. Conversations had happened behind my back at cookouts, school events, church luncheons, and neighborhood gatherings. Melissa had been building this version of me piece by piece while I continued paying for birthday gifts, ballet lessons, family vacations, and Christmas dinners. I suddenly felt exhausted in a way sleep could never fix. The waiter approached carefully with my birthday cake, still glowing with candles, completely unaware that the evening had already collapsed. Nobody sang. Nobody even looked at the cake. The poor young man stood frozen beside the table until Daniel awkwardly waved him away. I looked down at the gold script icing that read "Happy Birthday, Evelyn," and felt something inside me quietly shift. Not anger. Not yet. Something calmer. Something far more dangerous. Clarity. I set my napkin beside my untouched dessert and rose slowly from my chair. "I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the evening," I said politely. My voice sounded strangely steady. Melissa stared at me with wet eyes, probably expecting tears or yelling or some dramatic reaction that would confirm everything she had just accused me of being. But I simply picked up my purse. Then I looked directly at my son and asked the one question that would haunt me all the way home. "Daniel," I said quietly, "did you know she was going to do this tonight?" He did not answer. I did not say another word during the drive home, and neither did Daniel. The silence between us felt heavier than anything Melissa had said at the table. Outside the car windows, Connecticut suburbs passed by in soft yellow streetlights and quiet, manicured lawns, as if nothing inside my life had just fractured. Daniel kept his eyes fixed on the road, both hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. I could see it in the way his jaw flexed that he was rehearsing excuses he never actually said out loud. When we finally pulled into my driveway, I stayed seated for a moment longer than necessary. The engine was still running, but I did not move. I was waiting for him to speak first. He did not. "Did you know she was going to do that?" I asked again, my voice softer now, almost tired instead of angry. Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath someone takes when they have already decided not to tell the truth fully. "Mom," he started, then stopped, then tried again. "She just wanted to express how she feels. She has been under a lot of stress lately." That was not an answer. It was a shield. I looked at him carefully, really looked at my son, the boy I had once held through fevers and nightmares, the man I had helped through college tuition and mortgage down payments. "So you knew," I said quietly. He did not deny it. That silence told me everything. I stepped out of the car before the conversation could turn into something I would regret hearing. The night air was cool against my skin, but I barely felt it. Inside the house, everything looked exactly as I had left it that morning. A birthday card still sitting on the kitchen counter. Flowers from my church friends arranged neatly in a vase. A life that looked intact from the outside. But nothing inside me felt intact anymore. I poured myself a glass of water I did not drink and sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular. My phone buzzed once. Then again. A message from Melissa. "I am sorry you felt attacked tonight. That was not my intention." I read it twice. The wording was precise. Not an apology. A repositioning. Then another message appeared from an unknown group chat I had apparently been added to without my knowledge. Photos from the dinner were already circulating. Someone had taken pictures of Melissa crying, of Daniel comforting her, of me standing silently at the table like an accused stranger in my own birthday celebration. The captions were not kind. I set the phone down slowly. That was when I understood something I had refused to see for a long time. This was not a single moment of misunderstanding. It was a narrative already in motion. I thought back to the past year. The way invitations became less frequent. The way conversations paused when I entered rooms. The way Melissa always smiled just a little too quickly when correcting something I said, as if she were gently teaching me how to behave correctly in my own family. I had called it tension. I had called it adjustment. But now I saw it for what it was. Preparation. I walked upstairs to my bedroom and opened my closet, not sure what I was looking for until I saw the small locked file box at the top shelf. I had not opened it in months. Inside were documents I had almost forgotten about. Mortgage statements, tax records, receipts for major family expenses I had covered over the years. At first I only skimmed them, but the more I read, the more still I became. Numbers do not lie. Even when people do. By the time I closed the box, my hands were steady again. Not because I felt better. Because something in me had stopped reacting and started observing. Downstairs my house was still quiet. But the silence no longer felt like shock. It felt like distance forming between who I had been to this family and who I was about to become. I did not sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same scene repeating itself, not as it had been, but as I was beginning to understand it. The birthday table. The crystal glasses. The silence that followed Melissa's voice. But now I saw something else layered underneath it, something I had missed in real time. Planning. The next morning, sunlight came through my kitchen windows the same way it always did, soft and warm over the countertops, but I no longer felt comforted by it. I made coffee out of habit and sat at the same table where I had reviewed the mortgage documents the night before. My phone kept lighting up with notifications I did not open. I already knew what they would say. Sympathy from people who did not understand. Questions from people who were pretending they did. And versions of the story I no longer recognized as my own. By mid-morning, I drove to the grocery store just to leave the house. Inside, everything felt strangely normal. People were choosing fruit, comparing prices, talking about weekend plans. Life continuing without interruption. That was when I saw Linda from my neighborhood near the produce section. She hesitated before approaching me, the way people do when they are unsure which version of you they are allowed to acknowledge. "Evelyn," she said gently, her voice careful. I was not sure if I should say anything. I gave her a polite smile, the kind you learn to wear when you are not ready to explain your entire life in a public aisle. "It is all right," I replied. She nodded quickly, then lowered her voice. "Melissa told a few of us that things have been difficult at home for a while. I did not know it was like that." There it was again. Not curiosity. Confirmation. I realized then how efficiently a narrative spreads when it is told with emotion first and facts second. People hear what they are prepared to believe, I said quietly, almost to myself. Linda looked uncomfortable, then changed the subject quickly, asking about my birthday. I told her it was fine. That was easier than explaining that it had become something else entirely. When I returned home, there was a letter in my mailbox that I had not expected. It was from the Homeowners Association. Routine notices usually did not bother me, but this one felt different. My name was mentioned alongside a pending review of property arrangements, a phrase that meant nothing on its own but everything in context. I sat in my car for a long time before going inside again. That afternoon, I made a decision I had been avoiding since the night of the dinner. I called my attorney, not because I was angry, because I was finally paying attention. The consultation was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, I started organizing everything. Old bank statements, loan agreements, records of payments I had made quietly over the years without ever imagining I would need to justify them. Each document told a different part of a story I had once believed was simply family responsibility. Now it looked more like dependency disguised as generosity. That evening Daniel called. I almost did not answer. When I did, his voice sounded tired in a way that suggested he had been rehearsing words all day without finding the right ones. "Mom," he said carefully, "Melissa thinks it might be better if we all take some space for a while." I did not respond immediately. I waited, letting the sentence settle into its full meaning. Space from what exactly? I finally asked. There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough for honesty to either appear or disappear. It disappeared. From the stress, he said. I closed my eyes briefly. Stress. That was the word now. Not betrayal. Not humiliation. Not rewriting of family history in front of 40 people. Just stress. All right, I said calmly. Take your space. I ended the call before he could respond. The house felt different after that. Not empty. Not peaceful. Something more like a threshold. As if I had stepped out of one version of my life without yet entering the next. I stood in the living room for a long time that night, looking at photographs on the wall. Smiling faces. Family gatherings. Moments that now felt suspended between memory and misunderstanding. I did not remove them. Not yet. But I no longer looked at them the same way. And for the first time since my birthday, I understood something very clearly. I was no longer waiting for an explanation. I was preparing for what came after it stopped coming. I spent the next 2 days moving through my house like someone observing a life that no longer felt fully connected to her. Everything was still in its place, yet nothing felt settled. The quiet was no longer comforting. It felt intentional, as if the house itself was waiting for me to decide what kind of ending it would hold. On the third morning, I finally opened the file box again. This time I did not skim. I read everything slowly line by line, as if I were reviewing the life of a stranger who had been far too generous for far too long. Mortgage contributions, emergency payments, tuition support for Daniel when he changed majors twice, medical bills that were never reimbursed, vacation expenses I had covered, just this once more times than I cared to count. Each page added weight but also clarity. By noon, I had filled an entire folder with copies. Not for emotion, for structure. For truth. That afternoon, I met with my attorney, a calm, methodical woman named Margaret Collins who listened without interrupting once. When I finished explaining everything, she leaned back slightly and asked only one question. Do you want to protect what is yours? Or do you want to recover what was taken under informal arrangements? The wording struck me more than I expected. It was the first time anyone had framed my situation not as family difficulty, but as something measurable, something real in a legal sense. Both, I said quietly. She nodded as if she had expected that answer. Over the next hour, we reviewed every document again. She highlighted patterns I had never fully recognized. Financial dependence disguised as shared responsibility. Agreements made verbally but enforced emotionally. Property contributions that had never been formally acknowledged. When I left her office, I did not feel triumphant. I felt precise, like a blurred image slowly coming into focus. That evening, Daniel called again. This time I answered immediately, not out of hope, but out of necessity. His voice sounded different, more cautious, as if he had been warned about the conversation before making it. Mom, he began, Melissa thinks it might be better if we handle things privately from now on. No lawyers. No complications. I stood by the kitchen counter, looking at the folder I had brought home. Complications, I repeated. Is that what you are calling it now? There was a pause. Then he said, we are just trying to move forward. I closed my eyes briefly. Moving forward from what exactly? I asked. Another pause, longer this time. From everything that happened, he said finally. Everything. A word large enough to erase detail. I understood then that we were no longer speaking the same language. After the call ended, I did something I had not done in years. I visited my safe deposit box at the bank. Inside were documents I had almost forgotten about. Original receipts. Old correspondence. Copies of checks that had once felt like simple family support but now formed a consistent pattern. I requested official statements for every major transfer over the past 10 years. The bank clerk did not ask questions. People rarely do when they assume your business is ordinary. By the time I returned home, the sun was already setting. The house looked the same, but I no longer did. I placed all the new documents on my dining table and arranged them carefully. Not emotionally. Strategically. For the first time since that birthday dinner, I was not thinking about what had been said to me. I was thinking about what had been documented. And in that distinction, something irreversible had already begun. I received the invitation on a Thursday afternoon. A simple text message from Daniel that read like it had been carefully rewritten several times before being sent. We are having a small family barbecue this weekend. Melissa thinks it would be good for everyone. To talk things through in a relaxed setting. Relax was an interesting choice of word. I stared at the message for a long time without responding. The backyard gathering was scheduled for Saturday at 5 in the evening at Daniel and Melissa's house in West Hartford. I knew that house well. I had contributed to its down payment years ago, though that detail had slowly disappeared from family conversations over time. On Saturday, I arrived exactly on time. The neighborhood was quiet, with neatly trimmed lawns and the faint smell of charcoal in the air. From the driveway, I could already hear laughter coming from the backyard. Melissa had done what she always did when she wanted to control perception. She had made everything look warm and effortless. Folding chairs arranged in a semicircle. String lights hanging across the patio. A table filled with food that looked like it had been prepared for a magazine photograph rather than a family meal. Daniel greeted me at the door, his smile too quick, too practiced. "Mom, I am glad you came," he said. But his eyes kept shifting toward the backyard as if checking whether the atmosphere would hold. I stepped inside without answering. Melissa was already outside, moving between guests with a kind of confident ease that suggested she had rehearsed this moment in her mind many times before. When she saw me, she paused just long enough to signal attention, then walked over with a soft smile. "Evelyn, thank you for coming," she said warmly. "I really hope today can be a fresh start for everyone." Fresh start. Another carefully chosen phrase. Around us, family members and a few close friends from their neighborhood were already seated. I recognized the pattern immediately. This was not a casual barbecue. This was an audience. I took a seat near the edge of the patio, placing my purse beside me. I did not bring anything with me except a single folder, which I kept on my lap without drawing attention to it. For the first 20 minutes, everything followed a predictable rhythm. Small talk. Forced laughter. Comments about the weather and upcoming holidays. Melissa played her part perfectly, touching Daniel's arm occasionally, smiling at guests, presenting herself as calm and reasonable. Then, as dessert was being served, she stood up again. The shift in energy was immediate. I recognized it this time before she even spoke. "I think it is important we address what has been going on," she began, her voice steady, carefully neutral. "There has been a lot of misunderstanding about my relationship with Evelyn." Several heads turned toward me. I stayed still. Melissa continued, explaining how difficult it had been to feel judged in her own family, how she had tried repeatedly to create healthy boundaries. The language was softer than before, more controlled, designed for maximum acceptance in a social setting. Then she looked at me directly. "I never wanted conflict," she said. "But I also cannot continue pretending that everything has been normal." There it was again. The framing. Not accusation this time, but victimhood refined into narrative. I stood up slowly. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just enough to shift attention without demanding it. The backyard fell quiet in a way that felt familiar now. I opened the folder in my hands. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside the table. "Mom," he said under his breath, but I did not look at him. I placed the documents on the table one by one. Mortgage records, bank transfers, payment confirmations spanning years. No raised voice. No emotional collapse. Just structure. Melissa's expression changed subtly as she recognized what she was looking at. Not confusion. Calculation. The kind that comes when a story no longer holds its shape under evidence. I spoke calmly. "These are not opinions," I said. "These are records." No one interrupted. Even the laughter from earlier had completely disappeared. I continued, not faster, not louder. Simply steady. "For years, I contributed to this household in ways that were not acknowledged. That is not an accusation. That is documentation." Daniel finally lowered his gaze. Melissa's composure began to shift, not outwardly dramatic, but precise cracks forming in the structure she had built. The atmosphere in the backyard no longer belonged to her. It no longer belonged to anyone. It simply existed in the space between truth and story, and for the first time the difference between them was visible to everyone present. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The silence in the backyard had already done the work for me. Every person there was now looking at the documents spread across the table, as if paper could suddenly speak louder than years of storytelling. Melissa was the first to try to recover the moment. She gave a small, controlled laugh, the kind people use when they are trying to turn discomfort into misunderstanding. "I think there has been a mistake," she said carefully, stepping slightly forward. "These numbers do not show the full context." That word again. Context. A shield that only works when no one checks what is behind it. I looked at her calmly. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. With something closer to finality. "Then please provide it," I said simply. She hesitated. Just for a second. But it was enough. Because hesitation is not part of a rehearsed truth. Daniel shifted in his seat again. His hands clasped together now, elbows on his knees, staring at the ground like it might offer him instructions. Someone near the back of the patio cleared their throat, unsure whether they were still supposed to be comfortable. The social energy that had been carefully constructed all afternoon was now collapsing in layers. Melissa tried again, her voice slightly tighter this time. "Evelyn has always been generous, yes, but family support is not a transaction." I nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the sentence without accepting it. Then I reached into the folder and placed a second set of documents on the table. These were not financial summaries. These were confirmations. Bank records with dates, transfers, and references clearly marked. No interpretation needed. Only observation. A man seated near the grill leaned forward slightly, squinting at the papers. I saw his expression change before he even spoke. Recognition often arrives quietly when denial is no longer useful. Melissa noticed it too. Her breathing changed subtly, not dramatic but uneven. Like someone realizing the ground beneath them is not as solid as expected. "Why are you doing this now?" she asked, softer this time, the performance starting to lose volume. That question revealed more than she intended. It was not about timing. It was about control. I looked around the yard. At the chairs. At the faces. At the carefully arranged setting that had been meant to present harmony. "I am not doing this now," I said calmly. "This has been true for a long time. It is only now that it is being seen." That sentence changed the atmosphere completely. Not because it was dramatic, but because it removed ambiguity. Daniel finally stood up. Slowly. He looked exhausted in a way that went beyond the afternoon. "Mom," he said quietly, almost pleading, "can we talk about this privately?" I turned to him then. Not sharply. Just fully. "We have been talking privately for years," I replied. "That is part of the problem." He had no response to that. Melissa stepped forward again, attempting to regain emotional ground. "This is hurting people," she said, gesturing vaguely at the table, at the guests, at the situation itself. I paused before answering, letting the sentence settle in the open air. "What hurt people," I said evenly, "was not the documents being shown. It was the years of them being ignored." The word ignored hung in the space longer than anything else that afternoon. No one spoke immediately after that. Even the backyard sound seemed distant now. A bird somewhere in the trees. A chair shifting slightly on the patio stones. Normal life continuing just outside the boundary of a moment that no longer belonged to illusion. I gathered the remaining papers back into the folder, not rushed, not hesitant. Then I closed it. The sound was small but final. Melissa did not speak again. Not because she had nothing to say, but because the structure she had built no longer had a stable place to stand. I looked once more at Daniel, not as a son in crisis, but as someone finally seeing the difference between what he had been told and what had actually been lived. Then I stepped back from the table, not as an exit, as a decision already made. I did not move from my position right away. The backyard was still, but it was no longer the kind of stillness that came from tension. It was the stillness that follows understanding, when every person present realizes they are no longer participating in the same version of reality they arrived with. Melissa stood near the table without speaking, her earlier confidence now reduced to something more contained, more careful, as if any movement might cause further collapse. Daniel remained a few steps behind her, still upright, but no longer aligned with anything in particular. I held the folder in my hands for a moment longer, then placed it back on the table, not as a threat and not as a performance but as closure. When I finally spoke again, my voice was steady, not elevated, not emotional, simply resolved. I did not bring these documents here to win anything, I said. I brought them because I am no longer willing to participate in confusion about what has been real and what has been rewritten. No one interrupted. Not because they agreed, but because there was nothing in the sentence that invited debate. I continued, keeping my gaze level, not fixed on Melissa, not fixed on Daniel, but on the space between them where the story had been constructed for years. For a long time, I believed that being supportive meant absorbing imbalance. I believed that family meant silence in exchange for stability. I understand now that silence does not preserve stability. It only delays truth. Melissa's expression tightened slightly, not in anger now, but in the discomfort of losing interpretive control. The narrative she had built required agreement to survive. Without it, it could not sustain itself. Daniel finally spoke, his voice lower than before, careful in a way that suggested he was no longer trying to defend, only trying to contain consequences. "Mom, what are you saying exactly?" he asked. I looked at him directly then, without hesitation. "I am saying that I will no longer provide financial support that has no accountability, no transparency and no acknowledgement," I replied. The words did not carry hostility. They carried structure. Any arrangement that involves my resources will now exist only in formal terms, reviewed and documented appropriately. There was a brief silence after that, heavier than the earlier confrontation. Not because it was unexpected, but because it was final in a way that could not be reframed as emotional reaction. Melissa attempted to speak, but paused halfway through, recalibrating. When she did speak, her tone was softer, more controlled again, but now lacking the earlier certainty. "So this is about money," she said carefully, as if trying to reduce the moment into something manageable. I shook my head slightly. "No," I said. "This is about clarity." I adjusted my grip on the folder, then added, "Money is only the record. The issue is what was assumed without conversation for too long." Around us, guests remained silent, no longer shifting or reacting, simply observing the end of a structure they had been invited to witness but not participate in shaping. I took one step back from the table, then another. Not abruptly, not as departure under pressure, as completion of what I had come to do. Daniel's voice came again, quieter this time, less certain. "What happens now?" he asked. I paused briefly, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted the answer to be understood without escalation. "Now," I said calmly, "everything that involves me will be done with the same clarity I should have insisted on from the beginning." I turned slightly toward the side gate of the backyard, no longer looking at the table. The evening air felt unchanged, but everything within it had shifted into its correct proportion. Before I left, I added one final sentence, not as warning, not as reconciliation, but as definition. I will not be part of narratives that require me to disappear in order for them to feel complete. Then I walked away from the table, not quickly, not slowly, simply with continuity, leaving behind a silence that no longer belonged to confusion, but to consequence. I did not go home immediately after leaving the backyard. Instead, I sat in my car at the edge of Daniel and Melissa's neighborhood for a long time, watching the last light of the evening fade behind rows of perfectly maintained houses. Nothing dramatic happened outside the windshield. No confrontation followed me. No one came running after me calling my name. And yet everything had changed in a way that did not require further confirmation. The silence now felt complete, not unfinished. I finally started the engine and drove back to my own home in West Hartford, the same streets I had driven for years now feeling slightly unfamiliar, as if I was returning to a version of my life I no longer fully belonged to. When I arrived, I did not turn on all the lights. I only switched on the kitchen lamp and placed my keys in the ceramic bowl by the door. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. It no longer felt like waiting. It felt like resolution settling into place. I made tea not because I wanted it, but because it was a familiar motion that helped anchor my thoughts. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the stack of folders I had brought back with me. They were no longer just documents. They were records of boundaries that had never been properly defined. That night, I did something I had not done in years. I wrote a list. Not of grievances. Not of emotions. Just facts. Dates, contributions, transfers, and agreements that had existed without formal structure. Each line was precise, stripped of interpretation. By the time I finished, the list was longer than I expected, not because of recent events, but because of how long I had normalized them. The next morning, I returned to Margaret Collins' office. She reviewed everything again, this time with a more focused expression, as if the situation had fully transitioned from observation to execution. "You are no longer in a family dispute scenario," she said carefully. "You are in a documentation and restructuring phase." I nodded, understanding the distinction clearly now. We discussed formal separation of financial involvement, revision of any implied obligations, and the establishment of clear boundaries moving forward. There was no urgency in her tone, only precision. That precision gave the entire situation a different weight. It was no longer emotional. It was procedural. 2 days later, I received a message from Daniel. It was shorter than the previous ones. "Mom, can we talk? I think things went too far." I read it once, then placed the phone face down on the table. I did not respond immediately. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. For the first time, I understood that responding too quickly would return me to a cycle I had already exited. Instead, I continued organizing my records. I separated personal memory from financial fact, not because memory no longer mattered, but because it no longer needed to govern decisions. Later that week, I received a formal acknowledgement request from their side, through email this time, carefully worded and indirect. It referred to clarifying past contributions and ensuring mutual understanding moving forward. I read it slowly. It was structured language attempting to reconstruct equilibrium without addressing the imbalance that created it. I forwarded it to my attorney without reply. Days passed without further contact. The absence of communication was not emotional emptiness. It was transition space. I spent that time returning to ordinary routines that no longer felt disrupted. Grocery shopping, church on Sunday morning, conversations with neighbors that stayed within the boundaries of present moments, rather than revisiting recent events. Gradually, something began to settle inside me that was not relief and not resentment. It was proportion. One evening, I stood by my window and looked out at the quiet street outside. The world had not changed, but my place in it had. I was no longer waiting to be understood in someone else's narrative. I was no longer negotiating visibility inside a story that did not reflect my reality. I had become something simpler and more stable than before. I had become the person who decides what is recorded, what is accepted, and what no longer requires explanation. And in that quiet understanding, the story did not feel like an ending. It felt like alignment.